everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Great Game. As always, I am your co-host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and every other episode of Porkins Great Game by going to porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. And joining us, as he does every single month, to discuss the geopolitics of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the global war on terror is our good friend, Christoph Gehrman, who is, of course, a contributor to boilingfrogspost.com and runs the excellent blog New Great Game Roundup, which of course you can find every week, on boilingfrogspost.com, as well as on Christoph's personal website, christophgehrman.blogspot.com. Christoph, how are you?
Hello, Piers. I'm fine. Always great to talk to you.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I know I say this every single month, but this is I'm really excited about this episode. And we've got, again, always a ton of ground to cover. So I suppose we could just sort of jump right into this. And we're going to be starting, in a region that we've talked about many times before, and that is, of course, Xinjiang in China. And you pointed me to a very interesting article, which I hadn't, really picked up on. This is from Global Times, which is a pretty big news outlet in China, reporting on January 14th that they had arrested 10 Turkish and 9 Uyghur suspects involved in a human smuggling operation that was taking place in Shanghai. Now, this smuggling operation is alleged to source back to Turkey, where there were several Turkish individuals as well as a Uyghur individual who was living in Turkey that had charged these people that were trying to leave Xinjiang somewhere in the neighborhood of about $9,680. And this provided them not only with visas and fake passports, or forged passports, but fake invitation letters from the Chinese embassy in Turkey asking them to come. As I said, forged passports. These were allegedly real passports were purchased from individuals in Turkey, and then they were forged somewhere in China. Now, several of these suspects confessed to that they were going to go to Syria or Afghanistan or Pakistan. There was supposedly audio and video found that was meant to incite violence. And of course, Turkey was quick to deny that the Uyghurs were terrorists. There was a New York Times article that followed up on this Global Times piece that I said that, completely backed this up, and essentially stated that because Turkey's official statement did not mention any of the terrorism-related charges, that China must essentially be lying about this whole thing. But before we really kind of break this down and get into this sort of phenomenon that's been going on lately in terms of this migration of Uyghurs to Turkey, this is a fairly elaborate operation. We've got fake letters from the Chinese embassy in Turkey. We've got forged passports that are from real citizens, and this is, of course, a very common intelligence practice. It's much safer to take a passport that already belongs to somebody than to create an entire identity. And, of course, Christoph, as we've pointed out many times before, there is evidence of Uyghurs fighting in Iraq and Syria. So I guess, like I said, before we get into some of the specifics about how much this is going on, Christoph, what's your general sort of take on what happened back in January?
Actually, it happened in November. That's the
excuse me.
Yes, the article was published in January, and it's very, very, very important article. As the article mentions, the Chinese authorities have repeatedly pointed out that a few hundred Chinese citizens, it's not exactly clear how many, probably 200 or 300, mostly Uyghurs from Xinjiang, have joined ISIS or other terrorist groups in the Middle East. And Beijing's concern is, of course, that they could return to China and perpetrate attacks at home. And that's exactly the sense and purpose of the smuggling operation. The Uyghurs are smuggled out of the country, and then they are trained in Pakistan or in Turkey, and then they are used for various terror operations. And this whole operation, which we often refer to as Gladio B, has been going on since the 1990s. And we'll include a link to an interview by Sibel Edmonds with James Corbett where they talked about recent arrest and Xinjiang's importance in some detail. Eric Dracer wrote also a very good article about the arrest of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in Shanghai, which we'll also link up in the show notes. And I would like to draw attention to an interesting article by the Global Times, which was published in 2013 and which ties into the recent smuggling story. The 2013 article deals with the arrest of a 23-year-old Uyghur student named Mehmeti Ali, who returned to Xinjiang to carry out attacks after fighting in Syria with the Free Syrian Army, the moderate organ-eating rebels. And Ali had been studying in Turkey, like many other Uyghur students. And soon after settling down in Istanbul, he was approached and offered help by the East Turkestan Education and Solidarity Association. And before he knew what was happening, he was being sent to Syria and later to Xinjiang to spread freedom and democracy with a few bombs, in accordance with US NATO foreign policy. And Syria's ambassador to China pointed out that the Syrian government had been getting information from an informant in Pakistan that Uyghurs are receiving military training in Pakistan and are then brought to Turkey before being sent to Syria. And that's, of course, the usual modus operandi. And we've talked about Turkey's role as a main conduit for these operations in our previous podcast in some detail. And a Global Times article about the arrest of Ali in Xinjiang in 2013 is also very interesting because they mentioned that Ali was acting on behalf of the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is the terrorist organization tasked with liberating Xinjiang, and that the East Turkestan Islamic Movement works hand in hand with the East Turkestan Education and Solidarity Association, which is based in Istanbul, and which is supposedly a completely innocent group promoting the independence of East Turkestan. And there are several similar groups in Turkey, like, for example, the East Turkestan Culture and Solidarity Association, which is based in Kayseri. And you can find some of these groups rather easily by going on the homepage of the NED-funded Germany-based World Uyghur Congress and by taking a look at the affiliated organizations of the World Uyghur Congress. And this brings us back to the recent arrest of the Turks and Uyghurs in Shanghai and the likely reason for the Global Times article and why it was published in January, although the arrests took already place in November of last year. As some people have noticed, there have been a few media reports lately about Uyghur refugees who were detained in Thailand last year. They were trying to get to Turkey with altered Turkish passports, and the Chinese government has asked Thailand to repatriate the refugees, but Turkey has been trying to convince the Thai government of transferring them to Turkey. And China was furious with Turkey and wanted the Turkish government to stop interfering. And some of the Uyghur refugees who were not caught by the Thai authorities have managed to travel to Turkey, and they are now being sheltered by the East Turkestan Culture and Solidarity Organization in Kayseri.
Yes.
And the president of this organization is Syed Tümtürk, who is also serving as the deputy head of the World Uyghur Congress. And Tümtürk was quoted extensively in Turkish media about this issue, where he repeated some of the old World Uyghur Congress propaganda about the supposed massacre in Yarkand County last year and the so-called Ramadan ban. And he essentially made a case that the Uyghur refugees are only safe in Turkey. And that's, of course, what the Chinese government is trying to prevent, because they know exactly that the Turkish authorities are exploiting the Uyghur refugees just like they are exploiting the Chechen refugees, as we explained in our last podcast.
Absolutely, and I'd like to just touch on the issue of the Uyghurs within Turkey, because it seems to be fairly contentious, both within Turkey and within the AKP party, Erdogan's party, and you were writing in the New Great Game Roundup, and you had linked to an Al Monitor article where there was sort of discussing some of the pushback going on there, and of course, Turkey sort of claims that this is all sort of, out of the goodness of their heart and whatnot. But there are also elements within Turkey that see the Uyghur issue as being pushed perhaps by America in some sort of attempt to weaken relationships between China and Turkey, which is a really interesting element to this. But also, interestingly enough, our good friend Reba Kadir, the president of the World Uyghur Congress, has been repeatedly denied a Turkish visa to go and travel there. And of course, Kadir responded by saying that in Turkish media that there is in fact a Salafist influence and that there are several Turkish human smugglers sending Uyghurs to Iraq and Syria, which is a very interesting admission from someone that claims that this is never really the case. And then Turkish media responded by calling Kadir an infidel and an American spy for sale. So quite interesting, development, I guess, there. But Christoph, do you want to comment on that at all?
Yes, it's very interesting. I think that also ties into the power struggle between Erdogan and Gulen, which is still going on. And they are, of course, using every issue they can find to try to denounce the other side. And we also had this recent op-ed in the New York Times by Fethullah Gulen, where he was basically arguing that Turkey is turning into a dictatorship and that Erdogan has to be toppled as soon as possible.
Absolutely bizarre and insane. And yeah, I would suggest everyone goes and reads this New York Times op-ed. Obviously, Fethullah Gulen did not write it, but it is interesting. All the same, obviously. The chips are down and everything is coming out. And again, too, when you're reading a lot of these Turkish media reports, it's important to keep in mind, what papers are supporting, who, like Daily Sabah is, of course, the mouthpiece of Erdogan. Today's Zaman is much more the mouthpiece of Fethullah Gulen. So, of course, keep that in mind. And I guess just briefly, let's also just, remind everybody that, in fact, there are, like I said, there are, fighters from Xinjiang fighting in Syria and Iraq. And there was an interesting article, again, in the New Great Game Roundup, and they quoted a man, a fighter from Xinjiang, Abraham Mansour, who said, "No one wants to leave their hometowns and migrate to a war zone. However, trust and believe that living conditions in East Turkestan are far more difficult and suffocating than any war zone." So, again, pretty bold statement on going and fighting in a war zone, that this is better than living in Xinjiang. So, again, tensions seem to be fairly high. And, Christoph, we've reported many times on this that the situation in Xinjiang kind of waxes and wanes, but it seems like it's increasing lately. So I suppose we're going to have to look out for that. Is there anything else you want to, add before we move on to the next segment?
No, I just want to say that China is apparently trying to shut down some of these smuggling operations. I linked up a few other articles in my recent roundups where they were trying to prevent Uyghurs from traveling to Myanmar or to Vietnam. Apparently, most of the Uyghurs who are trying to leave China are trying to do so via Southeast Asia. And China is apparently trying to crack down on these illegal border crossings. That's, of course, one interesting development.
Yeah, and of course, we'll continue to follow up on the Xinjiang story because, obviously it doesn't really get nearly the amount of coverage that it should. But let's move on again to another country that we have focused several of the podcasts on, and that is, of course, Azerbaijan. In the past year, 2014, we saw Azerbaijan sort of lead a fairly serious crackdown on media freedom, on human rights activists, things of this nature. Shutting down all sorts of Western-funded NGOs. Late in December, this crackdown sort of it really went insane in the eyes of the West because they started to crack down against Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is, of course, the mouthpiece of the CIA and operates in nearly all of these countries on some level. And this started with the detainment of a pretty prominent RFERL journalist in Azerbaijan, Khadija Ismailov. This, of course, was sort of based on these bizarre charges that she was inciting a colleague to commit suicide, which is, they could try and come up with better reasons to arrest these people if they really wanted to. And this was swiftly followed by police raids on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty offices in Baku. They confiscated computers, documents, all sorts of other things out of the offices. They detained I think nearly the entire staff and questioned and interrogated them by Azerbaijani authorities. We also saw, several very high-ranking members of the ruling party basically, saying that this is because that, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is foreign funded. They're working with foreign intelligence. And we had a very interesting quote that me and Christoph were talking about off air. From a high-ranking member of the ruling party saying that every place that works for foreign intelligence and the Armenian lobby should be raided. So perhaps a veiled reference at the CIA, but just throwing in Armenia for good measure. And of course, Armenia and Azerbaijan are, constantly embroiled in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which we will probably be discussing in a little bit. But this led to a torrent of articles and rhetoric in the West about the supposed shift that Azerbaijan is going through, that they now they hate NATO and the West, and they are, they're fastly moving over to Russia, and, the closing of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is just the beginning. This is, of course, extremely similar to what me and Christoph talked about in episode 3 in Georgia, when Defense Minister Alessania was fired, and there was this, crisis going on where everyone thought that Georgia was, turning away from NATO, and, we'll explain how this isn't really the case with Azerbaijan either. And of course, no surprise, all the usual suspects are the loudest in voicing this sort of bullshit. So we had Joshua Kucera, who writes for EurasiaNet in the New York Times, Jeffrey Gedman, who's an ex-president of Radio Free Europe, writing in the Washington Post, and a very interesting article by Richard Kauserlark in the Brookings Institute. And Christoph, why don't you kind of break this down for us and flesh out this story a little bit? Because, again, it is one of those interesting cases where we see Azerbaijan sort of taking these broad steps against a news outlet for all intensive purposes is completely, funded by the CIA, or at least supported by them, and is very much their mouthpiece. But how should we be interpreting this? And why don't you give us a little insight into some of the criticisms coming from the West?
Yes, in recent months we have seen a lot of reports in Western media about growing authoritarianism in Azerbaijan and a supposed geopolitical shift away from the West. But the crackdown on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty at the end of last year prompted even more alarmist reports, as you mentioned, in the Washington Post and New York Times. And interesting Brookings Institution article bemoaning the end of the Heydar Aliyev era in Azerbaijan, when everything was fine. And since Azerbaijan is also a close ally of Israel, there were similar reports in the Israeli media. And one of the first people to address these alarmist reports was Israel's ambassador to Azerbaijan, who stressed that actually nothing had changed in Azerbaijani-Israeli relations. And the same is, of course, true of Azerbaijan's cooperation with NATO, which has been going on and has been completely unaffected by the war of words between the West and Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan's relations with its closest ally, Turkey, ensure that the country stays very close to NATO. As the war of words between Washington and Baku escalated, Azerbaijani leader Aliyev flew to Turkey to meet his buddy Erdogan. And although both leaders have fallen out of favor with some people in Washington, they are still acting in accordance with US interests when it comes to energy and foreign policy. During their meeting in Turkey, Aliyev and Erdogan stressed the importance of the Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline, for example, and they vowed to deepen military cooperation. which means, of course, that Azerbaijan is also closely military cooperating with NATO in the future. Therefore, I would be very careful when talking about a geopolitical shift of Azerbaijan. These reports should always be taken with a grain of salt. I think that Aliyev can't just simply do what he wants. And George Soros probably reminded him of this fact when they both met in Davos recently. And I would point out an interesting article by Sibel Edmonds, written in 2013, where she detailed how the Aliyev family was brought into the Western camp. And she pointed out that the US exploited Ilham Aliyev's weaknesses for gambling and prostitutes of all ages to blackmail the Aliyev family. So I think Aliyev knows that there's a certain red line which he can't cross. Shutting down Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is one thing, but if he were to end all cooperation with NATO, I guess he wouldn't last very long.
Right, of course, and I think that's the most important sort of factor here is that Aliyev, like any of these leaders, Erdogan, ultimately they are, of course, beholden to NATO and to the Gladio network. So, there's only so far they're going to go. And again, Christoph, you pointed out numerous times in a recent New Great Game Roundup that, Azerbaijan is going to participate in 116 different NATO exercises just this year. Another contingent of Azerbaijani troops was just sent to protect Kabul's international airport. And they've also increased the number of officers serving within the NATO structure. So, it's not like, anything is really changing. We might have these sort of cosmetic changes going on, of course. And there's been a torrent of, Gladio B actors, the former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan, former congressman and current chairman of the Azerbaijan-American Alliance, Dan Burton, singing the praises of Azerbaijan. But I also just wanted to kind of go back a little bit and just I know it's sometimes it can be silly to point out the sort of hypocrisy here, but there's also this. All of these articles seem to have just sort of realized that Azerbaijan might be repressive when it comes to press freedoms or human rights or things like that. And in that Brookings article, of course, he was bemoaning the end of Aliyev's father. His reign. Of course, a man who ruled brutally for, I believe, 10, 12 years, uninterrupted, of course, placed there by the West, was in no way, shape, or form a supporter of human rights. And in that article, as well as in the Washington Post, New York Times, in virtually all of these articles that were criticizing Azerbaijan, they were essentially all the exact same thing. But they also talked a little bit about Ramiz Medvedev, who is Aliyev's chief of staff, and he wrote apparently a very long, what Brookings called a Russian polemic on how the U.S. had been plotting to overthrow Azerbaijan for years and was working with the opposition, local opposition, to foment color revolutions and use a network of CIA-backed agents and pointed to Yugoslavia and the Arab Spring as examples of this. And of course, he's denounced as a conspiracy theorist and whatnot all around, even though it's fairly obvious that this is going on. But Christoph, I mean, like you said, we should be taking this with a grain of salt, obviously. Are we going to see this sort of even out, or is it going to be kind of, ramping up? And I mean, I don't know. What is your take on that? How are we going to see this evolving, say, in the next couple of months?
That's really difficult to say. As you pointed out, many people in Azerbaijan have been warning of CIA interference, for example, and activities of foreign-backed NGOs. And Azerbaijan has been cracking down on these NGOs in the last year. And Azerbaijan and other regimes which are in the Western camp, for example, neighboring Georgia as well, they have really kept a close eye on what's happened in Ukraine. When Yanukovych was toppled, they really realized that they could be the next regime which will be toppled by the US and the West. So they are trying to contain the danger which is posed, the threat which is posed by foreign-backed NGOs, for example, and they are very loud about this in the media, and they talk even about the interference, and are then of course labeled conspiracy theorists by the West. I'm not sure if they will be able to reach a deal. They will have to, I guess. But I think the war of words will continue for a while between Azerbaijan and Washington.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it is. Of course, we'll have to wait and see. One final thing with Azerbaijan, because of course, within all of this Western criticism, there was a slight aspect of this that could be kind of correct, and many of these articles pointed to the fact that a lot of this sort of pushback from the West derives from the increased tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the breakaway region that I mentioned before, Nagorno-Karabakh. And we've mentioned this briefly before, Christoph, but the war of words between these nations, which unfortunately in this digital age keeps happening on Twitter, has increased again, with Aliyev calling Armenia a powerless and poor country, and there's even been some more sporadic shootings and small skirmishes taking place on this border region. But do you want to just talk a little bit about what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh? This is an area that we see sort of flare up every once in a while, but it seems that obviously we had this helicopter crash that happened last year in that area, and the tensions do seem to be kind of increasing, and it does seem as if Azerbaijan could be using their sort of leverage, if you so to speak, with the West in terms of that they are this great ally. They are close with Israel. They are sort of a nation, a proxy against Iran and Russia. But could they be using this as leverage for, say, NATO or the United States to get more deeply involved in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, or to sort of come about with some sort of peace deal? What's your take on this, Christoph?
Yes, there was an interesting forecast by Stratfor at the beginning of this year, where they basically said that since Russia is now occupied with what's going on in Ukraine, that Azerbaijan could use this opportunity to escalate the conflict and try to get the upper hand. But I think they wouldn't really succeed in winning anything in Nagorno-Karabakh. That would only increase the violence, and in the end, both sides would lose. So it doesn't really make a sense. But they have been building up their military, of course, in recent years, and you have to wonder for what purpose. If they're really trying to use this. Russia has already stated, I think last year or in 2013, that if a conflict were to break out between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that Russia would intervene on the side of Armenia. And NATO is not going to intervene on the side of Azerbaijan. It's out of question.
That whole region is very complicated, more so by the fact that Russia is, of course, providing Azerbaijan with arms. And I guess that sort of leads us into our next segment, which is dealing with Armenia. And I don't think, Christoph, we've really previously gone into much detail about Armenia. But on January 2nd of this year, Armenia officially became a member of the Russian-led economic bloc, the Eurasian Economic Union, which also includes Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan as well. Now, this was met with a pretty mixed response internationally, as well as to a degree within Armenia. The more psychopathic international contingent viewed this as awful and a huge mistake for Armenia. Groups like the IMF and the World Bank, not surprisingly, were claiming that this wouldn't grow the economy and that only through, integration with Europe and selling to Europe would Armenia grow. Other Western media pointing to how stagnant the Russian economy is, which is somewhat silly, as a lot of this is being caused by the West. But Armenia's parliament did vote overwhelmingly to join the EEU. There were members of the opposition that voiced sort of dislike for this. And this is interesting, again, the sort of crossover between economics and geopolitics, Armenia is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place because Russia is essentially their only powerful ally. They are dependent on them for security, as we were just talking about, in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is essentially controlled by Armenia. But if Russia were to sort of, withdraw their support, Armenia would be, kind of screwed on that level. So, a lot of people were sort of viewing Armenia joining the EU as sort of, what other option do they have? But Christoph, do you want to break that down for us a little bit and just talk about what this means for Armenia, what this might mean for the Eurasian Economic Union?
Yeah, it's very important for Russia, of course. Armenia is Russia's only ally in the South Caucasus. So the Russians can't risk losing Armenia, and Armenians don't really have much choice either, given the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan, as you mentioned. And this brings us also to the biggest contentious point between Russia and Armenia, Russia's arms deliveries to Azerbaijan. Russia is supplying both sides of the conflict with weapons, much to the dismay of Armenia. And Russia argues that Azerbaijan would buy the weapons nonetheless, so they might as well buy Russian weapons. That's probably true, but it's only cold comfort for Armenia. And the Armenian government has long been warning that these Russian weapons could eventually be used against Armenia. And that's exactly what appears to have happened last year when Azerbaijan shot down an Armenian helicopter in Nagorno-Karabakh, which escalated the conflict. And Karabakh's defense minister claimed afterwards that a Strela air defense system supplied by Russia had been used to carry out the attack. And this caused tensions, and the usual media outlets were hoping that Armenia would reconsider its decision to join the EU, because the incident happened just a few days before the Armenian parliament voted on the ratification of Armenia's agreement to join the Eurasian Economic Union. But as we know, it didn't affect the vote, and Armenia joined the EU at the beginning of this year, which shattered all hopes in the West that Armenia could be wooed away from Russia. And shortly thereafter, the head of the Armenian office of the National Democratic Institute announced that the National Democratic Institute would suspend its operations in Armenia due to financial problems. They had not been particularly successful in Armenia since everyone knew what they were up to. But I think that's another sign that the West is realizing that Armenia is gone. And just when Russian-Armenian ties looked rock solid, a few days after the EU came into force, the relationship between the two allies was again put to the test. On January 12th, a Russian serviceman from Russia's military base in Armenia was caught when he tried to flee Turkey after murdering an Armenian family in Gyumri, where Russia's military base is located. And the killing of the family was very gruesome and provoked huge protests in Armenia, because many people were concerned that the Russian serviceman would not be held responsible for his crimes. And both the Russian and the Armenian government have tried to calm the situation down and agreed to conduct a joint investigation. But the biggest issue remains where Permakov will be prosecuted and by whom. And many Armenians have called for his prosecution in Armenia, and the Armenian government has just formally asked Russia to hand him over after the Russians announced that Permakov will be tried on the Russian military base in Gyumri. That's currently the biggest issue between the two sides. So although Armenia has just joined the Eurasian Economic Union, which makes the most sense for them, the relations between Armenia and Russia are still fraught with problems, and the West is, of course, trying to exploit this. Just after this incident happened with the Russian serviceman, the European Union offered Armenia to sign an association agreement without the free trade component, which is now redundant due to Armenia's accession to the Eurasian Economic Union. So they have not completely given up on Armenia. And if the relations between Armenia and Russia sour for whatever reason, they will try to move in again.
Oh, I just read an article the other day by Thomas DeWall at the Carnegie Moscow Center, where again he's trying to capitalize on this whole thing and talk about how out of touch Armenia's government is, almost in this bizarre sort of way where he's saying like, look, I mean, yeah, they don't care about this brutal murder of this family, and the Armenian people will rise up and defeat the evil Soviets. That's the sort of tenor of these articles. But yeah, a lot to pick apart there. I mean, first and foremost, this sort of highlights the tension, and this is this applies to all nations of having foreign troops stationed in your country, and of course of having this reliance on foreign troops to protect your security interests. So, in terms of Armenia, if they want to hold on to this breakaway region, Nagorno-Karabakh, they need the power of Russia to prop that up. Now, along with this, we get lots of foreign troops stationed in your country. And I mean, we can just point to, U.S. troops in South Korea and Japan that, literally get away with murder and rape and all sorts of things, because they're military service people. And of course, as you pointed out, Christoph, Armenia wants this guy tried in Armenia, in an Armenian court. I will say I don't know how likely or fair a trial he would get because the Armenian lawyer that was assigned to him, left the case after I believe it was one conversation with the Russian soldier in question. So yeah, again, this is actually become quite a big PR disaster for Russia, and this kind of derails all of the kind of hoopla that I'm sure they wanted to get into in terms of the EEU. So that is, again, very interesting. And I'd like to go back, if we could, just quickly to this closure of the National Democratic Institute, which, as you said, first it's been operating there since 1995. And as you said, it suspended its operations due to financial problems. And you pointed out in the New Great Game how incredibly lame this excuse was. And they cited that USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy just stopped funding them, which, on its face makes absolutely no sense. Why? And then you quoted, Armenian analysts pointing out this is a direct result of the EEU. But Christoph, you want to just comment on this again a little bit, because it's so funny. We were just talking about Azerbaijan and how human rights must be upheld. We've got to do everything. Oh my God, we can't lose Azerbaijan to the evil Russians. And then in Armenia, they seem to, as you pointed out in the New Great Game, they just sort of gave up on promoting democracy. So what is that? What's going on there?
Yes, I guess Aliyev should probably think about joining the Eurasian Economic Union if he wants to get rid of all the NGOs. No, I think the Armenian population never really bought into the propaganda of the National Democratic Institute and knew exactly what they were up to, and they tried to derail Armenia's accession to the Eurasian Economic Union. And I think now they have realized that Armenia is gone. They are very closely linked with Russia due to the military base, and now with the economic bloc. So they have really very few possibilities to woo Armenia away from Russia, and I think they have given up, sort of.
That seems to be the only logical explanation for this. Of course, it is just funny. They'll just give up on one country, but and that's the kind of double think almost that goes on with these sort of nations. Again, they're bitching and moaning about Azerbaijan, while of course they're still working with NATO. But Armenia that doesn't want to work with them. Oh, whatever, that's fine. They don't care. And then when something bad does happen, they suddenly are, oh, Armenia, look how evil Russia is. But let's get away from all the hypocrisy and whatnot. And I think we'll move on just quickly before we close out with our sort of closing segment. Christoph, we have a few updates. So last month we talked about the growing problem on the Tajik-Afghan border. And just a little while ago, Tajikistan has just built a military base on the Afghan border in response to this growing number of Taliban as well as assorted jihadi militants that appear to be massing in Afghanistan. And this was again backed up by recent news coverage in Uzbekistan. Christoph?
Yes.
Oh, I thought I lost you there. where, as I was saying, in Uzbekistan, there were also warnings that there were lots of fighters gathering in this area. And Christoph, you were talking about recently on the new Great Game of this sort of growing problem with ISIS and the Taliban and the sort of power struggle going on there. So anything you want to add to this?
Yes, that's of course very interesting that Tajikistan reacted so swiftly and built a new military base, or is trying to build a new military base. And Russia is also keeping a close eye on the situation. Russian Deputy Defense Minister Anatoly Antonov visited Tajikistan recently to alleviate concerns about slow deliveries of promised military aid and to discuss strengthening the Tajik army and the Tajik-Afghan border. Russian and Central Asian officials have long warned of an Afghan spillover, and recently they have also hyped the threat of ISIS in the region. And it would be very easy to dismiss all these warnings as fear-mongering, but recent developments suggest that there is something to it. There are definitely insurgents causing trouble in northern Afghanistan, on the border with Tajikistan as well as on the border with Turkmenistan. And many of these fighters are believed to be from Central Asia, probably belonging to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or other splinter groups. And there are, of course, also Taliban fighters. And recently, some of these fighters have apparently pledged allegiance to ISIS, which means they have basically changed their old flags for new ISIS flags. And it's difficult to say how serious the threat is, but it has prompted the formation of a new private militia called MARC, or DEF, which consists of allegedly 5,000 fighters and which is now going to fight against the insurgents in northern Afghanistan, regardless of whether they belong to the Taliban, the IMU, or ISIS. So the situation in Afghanistan, in northern Afghanistan especially, is definitely one thing to keep an eye on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why we wanted to include this as an update, because it really does seem like the situation, as you said, in northern Afghanistan is it really is developed every day. I mean, there is like a new sort of ramping up of tensions, and this no longer seems to be the sort of conjecture of a few Central Asian nations. I mean, people are really starting to pick up on the fact that a massive amount of fighters is beginning to form up in this area. Now, the other quick update, again, last month we talked a lot about some pipeline politics, and particularly with Russia dealing with the end of South Stream and what this meant, and some other things to that nature. But again, we see this the specter of pipeline politics in the background. Russia and Ukraine's gas deal is still very much in limbo. I believe they have only a few months before the official deal sort of ends, and they will have to come up with some sort of agreement after this. Now, Christoph, I'd really like to get your perspective on this. As someone living in Europe, of course, there's very much the idea that Europe is going to be a very big loser in this situation. Ultimately, it seems like every side in this argument is going to kind of lose no matter what they might say. Russia needs to sell gas, Ukraine is running out of gas, and the EU desperately needs to buy gas from Russia. Of course, the EU gets a third of its natural gas supplies from Russia, and half of this goes through Ukraine. What's going on exactly with the Ukraine-Russia gas deal? How do you see this playing out in the future?
Yes, in our last episode, we mentioned Russia's decision to abandon the South Stream pipeline and redirect the pipeline to Turkey. And this caused great concerns in Southeast Europe, which is now left out in the cold. And Bulgaria and several other EU member states refused to give up on the project. And they asked EU Energy Commissioner Maros Sefcovic to reach out to Russia and convince the Kremlin of reconsidering its decision. And therefore, Sefcovic flew to Moscow last month to meet with Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller. But he was very surprised to hear what Miller had to say, because the Gazprom CEO told him that the European Union will have to build new infrastructure to link up with the future Russia-Turkey pipeline or lose access to supplies. So Russia is definitely planning to cut all gas transit via Ukraine. And South Stream was, of course, designed to do exactly that, to deliver Russian gas to Europe, bypassing Ukraine, because Ukraine has always been an unreliable transit country, and even more so with the current regime in Kiev. But Brussels and Washington sabotaged the project, and Europe will now have to suffer the consequences. Gazprom also recently announced that the expansion of its Nord Stream pipeline, which links Russia with Germany, has been put on hold. And in light of the current new Cold War, it makes perfect sense for Russia to move away from the European market and sell more gas to Asia, in particular to China. As soon as the pipeline infrastructure is built between Russia and China, Russia will become a swing natural gas supplier between Asia and Europe, and they won't be dependent as much as before on the European market, which leaves Europe as the biggest loser in all of this.
I mean, it seems like such an insane game that they're playing, because, you know, I mean, like we've mentioned many times before, Europe, for better or worse, I mean, needs Russian gas. If they're not going to get gas from Iran, let's say, there's really not much else they can do. And it is the same thing with Ukraine. I mean, where are they going to get this gas from? You know, and of course, we've seen more and more insane rhetoric coming out of Ukraine, you know, in terms of the historical revisionism of World War II. But again, I mean, you know, Ukraine is, I mean, what are they going to do in all this? So it seems like, again, this is a pretty dangerous game that NATO is playing in terms of trying to isolate Russia when, as you just said, I mean, Russia will start selling to China or to Asia. Where is Europe going to get this? So, you know, let's definitely keep our eye on this, because this is really a pretty serious development in terms of this sort of new Cold War that's going on with Russia and NATO and the West. But Christoph, I guess we'll move on to our closing segment. And every month we try and pick a story within the war on terrorism milieu, something interesting. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're not so funny, and this month it is a not so funny story. We are going to be talking a little bit about Charlie Hebdo. We're going to leave aside the sort of you know, free speech arguments and you know, what was right, what was wrong, and instead really focus on the geopolitical aspect of this, and particularly the Al-Qaeda connections, or the alleged Al-Qaeda connections. And for anyone that doesn't know, Ayman al-Zawahiri and Anwar al-Awlaki were apparently behind this attack. Of course, al-Awlaki has been dead for 4 years after being vaporized in a U.S. drone strike. Ayman al-Zawahiri, God only knows where he is, if he is even alive as well. Now, Christoph, I'd like to get your initial take on this, but let me just say that for me, I found this incredibly bizarre. That they are sort of, again, resurrecting Zawahiri from the grave, as well as al-Awlaki, and that they would pick a man like al-Awlaki, who even now, you know, if you were to go on your search engine and put in his name, you would find mainstream media articles questioning if this guy was working for the FBI. So it seems like a bizarre character to use to associate these two gunmen in France with. But what's your take on this?
Yes, I have to say, I really tried to believe that Charlie Hebdo shooting was not some kind of staged event. They are making it really difficult to buy the official story. I wonder how often they want to use the trick with the found passport. And it's becoming rather obvious that the whole thing is fishy. What really struck me was when AQAP released this dubious video claiming responsibility for the attack, where a senior AQAP leader described it as the blessed Battle of Paris and said that the attack was carried out with the guidance of none other than Ayman al-Zawahiri. And a spokesman for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence confirmed immediately that the video is authentic. Okay, so you're telling me that the attack was carried out with Zawahiri's guidance. Never mind that Zawahiri is a Gladio B operative and has been working for Western intelligence since at least the 1980s. Makes perfect sense. And to top it all off, we have the resurrection of another Al-Qaeda leader with long-standing ties to Western intelligence, Anwar al-Awlaki. One of the Charlie Hebdo suspects told a journalist that Alaki had financed him when he went to Yemen a few years ago, which is not particularly helpful when you're trying to make the case that Western intelligence had nothing to do with the Charlie Hebdo event. In my opinion, the whole Charlie Hebdo shooting is an example par excellence of Gladio's strategy of tension, which aims to divide, manipulate, and control public opinion. The event can be used to justify military intervention abroad and to crack down on dissent at home, as we have seen in France with the arrests of people who have posted the wrong stuff on social media, for example.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is what the real story here is really about. Anyone that's interested, me, Tom Secker, and Guillermo Jimenez discussed Charlie Hebdo recently on an episode of Clandestine, so we'll link that up in the show notes as well. And just, again, it's important to note that the evidence that these two individuals spoke with al-Awlaki is sourced from an anonymous Yemeni intelligence official. Who is this guy? How did he and it's like he just came forward. And, oh, damn, right, those guys who were on the radar of French intelligence, they met with al-Awlaki. Sorry, whoops, dropped the ball there. But I think, again, looking even more geopolitically, I think we should really be looking at what is going on in Yemen itself. And this is, again, a country that is extremely important to the Gladio network, to the American deep state. It gets very little attention, but there is virtually a civil war, or a civil war about to really go full blown there. We've got the Houthis, which are a Shia sect within Yemen that have essentially overthrown the entire government. They took over the presidential palace. President Hadi, who was, of course, handpicked by the U.S. and was beloved by none other than Hillary Clinton, has resigned along with the entire cabinet and government. And lurking in the background of this Houthi rebellion is a Gladio actor par excellence, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who is believed to be supporting the Houthis, and by some accounts, including Al Jazeera, which is dubious sometimes, is actually directing them, and they produced a phone conversation allegedly between Saleh and the head of the Houthis. But I think this is really important to understanding Charlie Hebdo, because they are, of course, linking this to Yemen. So then we have to look at what is going on in Yemen right now. Just a few days ago, I believe, Ali Abdullah Saleh's party held talks with the Houthis. Of course, Saudi Arabia and the GCC hate the Houthis because they see Iran as being behind them. And while Iran has, rhetorically at least, supported the Houthis, and in the past, I'm sure, has provided them with certain things, they're not like Hezbollah. The Houthis are really specific just to North Yemen. Most interestingly, Christoph, feel free to jump in after this. Undersecretary for Defense of Defense for Intelligence, Michael Vickers, told the Atlantic Council just recently that the U.S. maintains intelligence relationship with the Houthis due to their anti-Al-Qaeda stance, and actually used the term formal agreements, that the U.S. has formal agreements with the Houthis. And that, while the Houthis are attacking Al-Qaeda, they are actually being supported by U.S. drones. So I guess this is sort of a long-winded explanation, but I wonder if this isn't about perhaps giving Al-Qaeda one last big battle in Yemen. That seems to be the only place that they're really active. We only ever really hear about AQAP. We don't hear about Al-Qaeda in any other context. Not in Syria anymore. Not in Pakistan, things like that. So perhaps this is a way of kind of giving Al-Qaeda one last battle, and this might also be a way of bringing back Saleh, which would be in line with virtually every other country involved in the Arab Spring. We have in Egypt. The military dictatorship of al-Sisi is, this is Mubarak, essentially. And in Tunisia, the 88-year-old Ben Ali Crony Essabi was just elected as president. So it would only be fitting if Saleh comes back. But Christoph, do you want to add anything to this? Get your take on this. I know that we've talked many times about where is Al-Qaeda going, what direction. So, feel free to jump in on any of that.
Yes, as we predicted in one of our last podcasts, that for 2015, that Al-Qaeda might see the end coming anytime soon. If they take out al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda is basically gone. They are still in Yemen. But other than that, there's, of course, Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which is working hand in hand with the Israeli regime. But they are never referred to as Al-Qaeda. They are always called al-Nusra Front or Jabhat al-Nusra. So there's only AQAP in Yemen. And perhaps they are trying to make, as you said, a big final for Al-Qaeda and then move on with the new terrorist group, ISIS.
Yeah, and again, we'll have to see where ISIS is going, because at the moment, I mean, it seems that, we're now back into the cycle of beheadings. We sort of, that happened, and then, everyone said, oh, all these videos are fake, so they stopped doing that, so they started throwing people off buildings, shooting people in mass graves. But now we've recycled back to the beheadings, and now we've got, burning people alive. So, again, all very interesting. We're going to have to kind of, keep an eye on all of this. Christoph, anything on Xinjiang, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Charlie Hebdo, anything you want to add quickly before we sign off?
No, I think we mentioned pretty much anything.
All right, excellent. So I'd like to thank everybody, of course, for joining me and Christoph on this episode of Porkins Great Game. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to hear some more of me and Christoph's work, then please go to porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. And you can find all of these podcasts. Of course, you can also find them on my YouTube channel, which I hope you subscribe to, which is youtube.com/1138porkins. And of course, Christoph, where can everybody find your work? And I know that you are also, you have maybe a small announcement, but you were also a contributor to a new website as well. So please let the listeners know about that.
Yes, of course. You can find all my work on my blog, christophgerman.blogspot.com, where I cover the new Great Game in Central Asia and the Caucasus region. And I'm, of course, still writing for Boiling Fox Post, where the new Great Game appears every week. And I'm now also a regular contributor to Russia Insider, where I will be also focusing on the new Great Game. But I will also keep an eye on what's going on in Germany with regard to the new Cold War.
Yeah, excellent. And I really encourage everyone to go and check out Christoph's new articles on Russia Insider. They're really good. There's an excellent one talking about the Georgian influences in Ukraine, which is, of course, a topic that we've spoken about before. And just quickly, I also have a slight announcement as well. And I just wanted to let all the listeners know that me and Tom Secker have a brand new podcast series that's going to be coming out in just about a month. It is called The CIA and Hollywood, and I'll provide a link in the show notes, but I just wanted to let everybody know. It's a brand new series. We're going to be dealing exclusively with the connections between the CIA and Hollywood. We're going to have lots of great guests, including Sibel Edmonds, Thomas Sheridan, Aaron Franz, Guillermo Jimenez, and a whole bunch of others. So just wanted to let everybody know about that. And of course, again, please, if you have any questions, comments, things related to the new Great Game, to this global war on terror, then of course you can always tweet me and Christoph, and you can tweet me at Porkins Policy, and you can always tweet Christoph at New Great Game. Well, I think with that, Christoph, we'll leave it there. And thank you again, buddy, for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Piers.